Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our channel, where stories aren't just told, they're felt. If you're someone who believes in empathy, justice, and truth, you're in the right place. They say time heals everything. But what if the wound keeps getting reopened again and again in everyday moments that most people don't even notice? Racism isn't always loud. It doesn't always scream through burning crosses or hateful slurs. Sometimes it whispers through silence avoidance and lost opportunities. Some might say, come on, things are better now. Why keep talking about racism? Others might argue, exactly because it's hidden. Now it's more dangerous than ever. Where do you stand? Before we get into the full story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more real voices, raw truths, and honest conversations to light. Every click counts, and every story matters. Now, let's begin. The cabin lights glowed soft and golden, but there was nothing warm about the tension that would soon grip Flight 558. Outside, Los Angeles basked in its usual morning calm, the runway humming beneath a flawless stretch of blue sky. Inside, a luxury first-class cabin buzzed with the quiet comfort of people sipping lattes, scrolling emails, and settling into their plush leather seats. Everything looked ordinary, safe, predictable. But sometimes the most devastating storms don't come with thunder or lightning. They come from whispers, side glances, and a single cruel decision that ignites chaos at 30,000 feet. Leah Donovan, just 8 years old, sat in seat 1A by the window, her legs barely reaching the edge of the seat. A tablet rested on her lap, its screen filled not with cartoons, not with games, but with complex mathematical formulas most adults couldn't comprehend. She wasn't a normal passenger, not by any definition. Leah was a prodigy, a girl whose mind had stunned professors and scientists alike, a girl about to make history as the youngest ever inducted into the International Mathematics Hall of Fame in Boston. She wasn't smiling or fidgeting like most kids her age would. She was calm, focused, completely unaware that the world around her was about to turn her brilliance into a target, and the person who would light the match Cassandra Bellamy. At 46, Cassandra wore the polished armor of a corporate executive, a tailored jacket, perfect lipstick, and a smile that rarely reached her eyes. She wasn't just flying to Boston for a conference, she was flying for survival. Her job at Ashcroft Technologies, the billion-dollar empire owned by Leah's father, was hanging by a thread after a string of failures. She needed this trip to prove she was still valuable. But beneath her desperation simmered something darker, older, a deep-seated belief in an unspoken hierarchy, one where someone like Leah, a young black girl sitting confidently in first class, wasn't supposed to exist. Not here. Not at this altitude. The other passengers barely noticed the undercurrent of hostility building. Temperance Lee, the seasoned lead flight attendant, moved with practiced grace, her warm smile belying the instinctive tension she felt when she caught Cassandra's gaze darting toward Leah. A few rows back, Marissa Cole, a quiet, observant woman with an air of authority that most mistook for shyness, scanned the cabin. No one knew she was a federal air marshal. No one knew she would soon play a role in unraveling a lie so cruel it would feel cinematic even as it destroyed lives in real time. Arthur Lynn, a silver-haired venture capitalist who had built his fortune by trusting his gut, sat polishing his glasses, ready to pass judgment on anyone who didn't fit the mold. Selena Ward, a young mother with her phone always at the ready, thumbed through social media, blissfully unaware that her camera would soon capture footage seen by millions around the world. None of them. None of the business travelers. None of the casual observers. None of the airline crew had any idea that they were about to be cast as unwilling players in a story that would end with headlines, lawsuits, and a reckoning no one could stop. As the plane lifted off the runway, slicing upward into the serene morning sky, Leah kept tracing numbers on her screen, her lips moving silently as she solved a problem that would have stumped PhD candidates. Cassandra sipped her drink. Her gaze fixed her jaw tight as she watched Leah's small fingers dance across the screen. To Cassandra, those numbers didn't matter. The girl solving them didn't matter. What mattered was a narrative she had already written in her head, that Leah didn't belong here, that someone had made a mistake, that she, Cassandra, would fix it. At 30,000 feet, where the world below shrank into nothing but patches of cloud and blue, Flight 5558 looked like the picture of peace. But storms rarely announce themselves. They start as a flicker, a whisper, a single falsehood dropped like poison into still water. And when Cassandra finally decided to act to make her move against an innocent child, it wouldn't just be a confrontation over a seat. It would spiral into a chain of events so shocking, so humiliating, and so publicly devastating that no one on board, especially Cassandra, would ever escape its shadow. This is where it began. A calm morning, a genius child, a desperate woman, and a plane full of strangers about to witness how fast a quiet flight can descend into chaos when prejudice takes the pilot's seat. And what happened next? That's where the real storm began. The first sign that something was about to fracture came not from words, but from the way Cassandra Bellamy's smile tightened into something razor thin as she returned from the lavatory. The hum of the engines drowned out everything except the faint scrape of her heels as she moved down the aisle, her hand lingering on the back of each seat she passed. To everyone else, she looked calm, collected, even polite. But behind that carefully curated calm was a plan forming one that would turn this quiet flight into a nightmare for a child who didn't even know he was a target. Leah Donovan, still perched in seat 1A, remained lost in her calculations, oblivious to the glances darting her way. Each flicker of Cassandra's gaze carried a judgment so sharp it could cut glass. To Cassandra, every second Leah sat there was an affront, not just to her pride, but to her worldview. In her mind, there was no conceivable reason a young black girl should occupy the same luxury she had clawed her way into. Her failure at Ashcroft Technologies, the company Leah's father owned, was bad enough. Seeing this girl, his daughter, comfortably inhabiting a space she believed was earned, not given, lit a fire of resentment she couldn't swallow. It was more than bias. It was desperation laced with hate, and it needed an outlet. Temperance Lee, the lead flight attendant, sensed the tension building like static before a storm. Her eyes flicked between Cassandra and Leah, and for a moment she thought about stepping in, maybe checking Leah's ticket again, maybe finding some way to diffuse what felt inevitable. But years of smoothing over business class tempers taught her a dangerous truth. People like Cassandra didn't calm down with logic. They escalated when they felt challenged. So Temperance watched her instincts screaming that something wasn't right, her voice caught behind a professional smile. 10 rows back, Marissa Cole shifted slightly in her seat. To the casual observer, she was just another business traveler, nursing a bottle of sparkling water. But as a federal air marshal trained to detect subtle signs of escalation before they ignited, she noticed the way Cassandra's shoulders squared each time she looked toward Leah. She saw the faint twitch of Cassandra's fingers brushing the edge of her blazer pocket, the way her eyes tracked the other passengers, gauging their reactions. Marissa didn't move. Not yet. She'd learned to wait until the story became clear before revealing her presence. Arthur Lynn, the silver-haired venture capitalist, was too busy scanning headlines on his tablet to notice much of anything. But when Cassandra stopped beside his seat, leaning down just enough for her voice to reach him, his ears perked up. "Can you believe this?" she murmured, gesturing discreetly toward Leah. "Traveling alone, first class. Probably some influencer stunt or spoiled rich kid. It's sad, really. Parents don't teach kids respect anymore." She said it softly, like she was confiding in him, planting seeds of judgment without ever sounding outright hostile. Arthur, a man who prided himself on reading character, glanced toward Leah and frowned. It wasn't a full decision, but the seed had been sown. Cassandra didn't stop there. Over the next 20 minutes, she worked the cabin like a conductor, weaving small remarks into casual conversations. To the couple in row 2, she sighed about how times have changed when airlines allowed unaccompanied minors to take seats away from paying executives. To Selena Ward, the young mother, fiddling with her phone. Cassandra whispered, "I just worry about kids like her traveling alone. Who knows what kind of trouble they can cause?" Each statement was delivered with an air of concern, not accusation. Each interaction nudged the cabin closer to a conclusion. Cassandra had already decided Leah didn't belong here, and if Cassandra had her way, Leah wouldn't be here for much longer. Then came the move. Subtle, calculated, choreographed like she'd practiced it before. Cassandra excused herself to the lavatory again, her untraceable burner phone tucked discreetly into her jacket pocket. It wasn't her main phone, the one filled with work emails, contacts, and data. This one was clean, a device with no history, no personal connections, nothing that could trace back to her. When she emerged, she stopped near Leah's seat, her face a mask of contrived warmth. "Oh, sweetie, excuse me," she said, as she pretended to stumble her hand brushing Leah's backpack as she caught herself. No one thought twice about it. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than a clumsy moment. But by the time Cassandra straightened her blazer and returned to her seat, the phone was no longer in her pocket. It was buried deep in Leah's bag, waiting like a loaded trap. Leah, oblivious, didn't even notice the weight shift in her belongings. She was still tracing equations across her screen lips, moving softly as she solved a proof that could have won her college scholarships before she'd even hit middle school. 10 minutes passed. Cassandra bided her time, letting the cabin settle into that post-meal lull where conversations quieted and the hum of the engines became a lullaby. Then, like the flip of a switch, her voice rose, panicked and frantic. "My phone. Oh my God, my phone is gone." She cried, her pitch high enough to slice through the calm. "It has all my work contacts. My entire career is on that phone. Someone must have taken it." Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Concern spread like wildfire. Her eyes swept the cabin wide with faux distress before locking onto Leah. "That girl Cassandra," gasped, her finger trembling for effect. "She's the only one near me. She must have it. Check her bag." It was all the crowd needed to pivot. The murmurs grew louder, laced with indignation. Arthur Lynn leaned forward, his earlier doubts crystallizing into certainty. Selena Ward, phone still in hand, began recording, muttering, "This is unbelievable." Temperance Lee tried to intervene, her hands up in a calming gesture. "Ma'am, let's not make accusations." But Cassandra cut her off, her voice laced with just enough hysteria to sound convincing. If you won't do it, I'll call the authorities myself. This is theft. This is a crime. Leah, finally pulling her attention from her tablet, blinked up at the adults closing in on her. Her voice was so small, so fragile it barely cut through the noise. I didn't take anything. I swear. But no one listened. Not yet. The trap had been set. The seeds of doubt planted so carefully had bloomed into full suspicion. And as the tension in the cabin thickened, as more passengers began to circle, like vultures sensing blood, the next move would push this ordeal past the point of no return. What happened when they opened Leah's bag would ignite a storm no one on Flight 558 could escape. It began with the sharp crackle of the intercom, a sound that cut through the rising chaos like a blade. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. Due to a security incident, we are diverting to Denver International Airport for an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The announcement was calm, professional, but beneath its measured tone was the weight of something far heavier. Judgment had already been passed. To most on board, the incident was already solved. Leah Donovan, 8 years old alone, brilliant and terrified, was now marked as the culprit, before the truth had even been sought. The first-class cabin erupted into whispers and murmurs, the kind of hushed conversations that carry more poison than shouting. Good, muttered Arthur Lynn, adjusting his cufflinks with self-righteous satisfaction. Children like that need to learn early. Others nodded, their faces stiff with indignation, each one convinced they were part of some righteous cause, that the removal of a child somehow restored order at 30,000 feet. Cassandra Bellamy, at the center of it all, reclined in her seat like a queen awaiting her coronation, a thin smile tugging at her lips as she whispered to Selena Ward, "It's tragic, really. But someone has to hold people accountable." Leah's world, however, had shrunk to the size of her tear-soaked sleeve and the glowing lines of a calculus proof she couldn't finish. Her fingers trembled as she traced the numbers, not because she was afraid of math, but because math was the only place left where the rules felt fair, where answers weren't decided by skin color or whispers. Her breath came in shallow bursts. She looked so small against the leather seat, her backpack still beside her, as if its very presence was the weight dragging her toward ruin. The plane descended through turbulent air, each shudder of the fuselage sending a fresh spike of panic through Leah's chest. The lights flickered briefly as the landing gear lowered, casting fleeting shadows across faces that had turned cold, curious, and unkind. From her seat near the galley, Temperance Lee clenched her jaw. She had seen passengers lash out before entitled executives, unruly travelers. But never had she seen so many adults move in lockstep against a child. Her gut twisted with something she couldn't yet name, a mix of dread and the shame of complicity, because she, too, hadn't yet stopped it. When the plane slammed onto the Denver tarmac, the wheels screamed against the asphalt like the exhale of some furious god. Red and blue lights flared outside, splashing the cabin in rotating colors that made the scene inside feel more like a raid than a landing. Emergency vehicles encircled the aircraft, their engines rumbling beneath the muffled hum of the air conditioning. Conversations quieted into a tense, expectant silence. Everyone was waiting for the final act. The heavy, synchronized footsteps of law enforcement echoed through the jet bridge, a rhythm that made even the most self-assured passengers straighten in their seats. Detective Rivera and Officer Torres, boarded with faces set like stone, scanning the cabin as if they were entering hostile territory. Their hands hovered near their belts, not quite on their weapons, but close enough to project authority. We're here for the suspect, Rivera announced, his voice, cutting through the stagnant air. And then his gaze fell on Leah. For a moment, Leah didn't understand. Her eyes, wide and rimmed red, darted between the two towering figures in navy uniforms. Her small hands gripped the edges of her seat. Suspect, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Rivera and Torres weren't listening to whispers. They moved down the aisle with the inevitability of a storm, each step erasing any hope she had left. Cassandra's voice rang out like a gunshot. "Officers, that's her. She stole my phone." Everyone saw it fall out of her bag. Her tone was triumphant, dripping with righteous fury. Arthur Lynn chimed in immediately, his voice carrying the gravity of his age. "It's true. I saw it with my own eyes, clear as day." Selena, still filming, added softly, "It's on record, officers. Everyone knows." The lies weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were delivered with calm conviction, and that made them all the more dangerous. Officer Torres pulled a pair of child-sized restraints from his belt tools, designed for the rarest, most extreme circumstances, and knelt to Leah's level. The metallic click of the cuffs snapping open felt deafening, unnatural in a cabin meant for comfort. Leah froze. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, a sob broke free, a sound so raw it made even Temperance Lee flinch. "I didn't do anything," Leah whispered, her voice splintering. "Please, please, I just want to go to Boston. I didn't take anything." Torres's face betrayed a flicker of hesitation, his jaw tightening, his eyes softening for just a fraction of a second. But procedure overrode humanity. The cuffs locked around Leah's tiny wrists with a soft snick, the weight of them far heavier than the ounces of metal they contained. "Leah Donovan, you're under arrest for suspected theft." Rivera intoned his words, flat and official, as though reciting a script he'd said 100 times before. The cabin exhaled collectively, as though justice, however twisted, had been served. Leah's composure shattered. Her body shook with sobs that racked her chest, each gasp a plea that went unanswered. "I want my mom. Please, I didn't do anything. Call my mom. Please, someone call her." Her voice wasn't just desperate. It was breaking, the kind of cry that lodges itself in the memory of anyone who hears it echoing long after the sound fades. But the adults around her didn't move. They didn't comfort her. Some stared at their screens. Some turned away their faces, stiff with avoidance. And some, like Cassandra, allowed a shadow of satisfaction to creep into their smirk. Through it all, Marissa Cole, the quiet woman in 3C, remained still. Her hand brushed the edge of her jacket where her credentials rested. She had seen enough, more than enough. But timing was everything, and exposing the truth too soon would only let Cassandra escape with a bruise instead of a reckoning. So Marissa weighted her eyes, scanning her phone quietly, recording every moment. As the cabin door opened, and Leah, handcuffed and shaking, was led toward the jet bridge, the entire plane seemed to hold its breath. The Denver air beyond was cool and sterile, the flashing lights painting everything in surreal shades of blue and red. Leah's feet stumbled on the threshold, her voice reduced to a whisper so faint it barely reached the ears of the officer beside her. "Why is this happening? I just wanted to solve my problems." What Leah didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this was not the end of her story. It was the hinge, the moment everything would tilt. Because beyond those flashing lights, beyond the tarmac, a force far greater than Cassandra Bellamy's cruelty was already in motion. 3 black SUVs were cutting through Denver traffic, their engines snarling their arrival, promising a reckoning so complete it would silence every whisper that had condemned Leah. The breaking point had been reached, and soon it wouldn't be Leah Donovan trembling, it would be everyone who had decided she didn't belong. The sound came first, a low, commanding growl of engines rolling across the Denver tarmac. Through the cabin windows, shadows stretched long beneath three black SUVs as they swept toward the plane, moving with precision that spoke of power and intent. The murmurs began immediately soft and nervous as passengers craned their necks to see who or what was coming. Even Detective Rivera's posture shifted subtly, his shoulders straightening as though he too understood that whoever was about to step through that jet bridge wasn't someone to be dismissed. Leah Donovan sat hunched in the front row, her wrists still bound in cuffs far too heavy for her frame. Her tear-streaked face tilted toward the glow of the aisle floor lights. She didn't see the convoy. She only heard the dull roar, the unfamiliar rhythm of boots, not the hurried, clumsy steps of police, but the measured, deliberate cadence of people accustomed to commanding entire rooms. Her lips moved soundlessly, whispering to herself, clinging to numbers and sequences, math problems. She couldn't quite finish her only anchor in the storm. Cassandra Bellamy, who had spent the last half hour wearing her triumph like a crown, froze when she saw the SUVs. At first, she didn't understand. Her smirk faltered as the doors opened one by one, and figures emerged, not police, not airline officials, but a small, silent unit in tailored suits and discreet earpieces. At their center walked a man whose very presence sent a ripple through the cabin. Donovan. 6'2", shoulders squared beneath a charcoal gray suit that whispered bespoke craftsmanship, every line of his body, radiating authority that no title needed to confirm. His gaze was cold, surgical, sweeping the cabin with the precision of someone used to measuring value and threat in the same breath. Passengers instinctively sat straighter, their previous confidence dissolving into uneasy silence. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop, as though his arrival had drawn all the warmth out of the air. His first words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. "Officers," he said, his voice smooth but edged like steel. "That's my daughter." The weight of the words hit harder than a shout. It wasn't just paternal fury. It was a statement that carried the backing of boardrooms, markets, and entire industries. The officers glanced at each other, uncertainty flashing across their faces as recognition settled in. Rivera swallowed hard. "Mr. Donovan." "We were told there was a theft." Donovan's hand lifted, silencing the explanation before it could form. "You'll want to be very careful with what you say next," he said, his voice low but resonant. He turned his gaze toward Leah, still trembling in her seat, the cuffs biting into her wrists. His jaw tightened, the only outward crack in his otherwise impenetrable composure. "Remove those," he commanded softly. Torres hesitated only a second before obeying the metallic click of the cuffs, releasing sounding like an exhale the entire cabin had been holding back. Leah all but collapsed into her father's arms, her body shaking as she buried her face against his chest. Donovan's hand rested gently on her back, his touch steady grounding. "You're safe now, Leah," he murmured, his tone transforming steel, melting into something warm, protective, and heartbreakingly tender. But when he looked up, his eyes locked on Cassandra Bellamy, and the warmth vanished. Cassandra's world began to tilt before he even spoke her name. The recognition came in waves, first understanding who Leah's father was not just her CEO, but a man whose influence extended so far that a word from him could end entire careers. Then the realization that every smug word, Every calculated move she had made was about to be held up to a light she could never escape. Her breath came shallow, her fingers tightening on the armrest. "Mr. Donovan," she stammered, her voice brittle. I I think there's been some misunderstanding." Donovan didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, his gaze sweeping toward the quiet woman in 3C. "Agent Cole," he said, his tone all business now. Marissa stood, pulling a slim device from her jacket pocket, her movements deliberate. She stepped into the aisle, her voice even carrying across the stunned cabin. "For the record, I am Agent Marissa Cole, Federal Air Marshal, assigned to Flight 447. I have video evidence of Ms. Bellamy intentionally planting a secondary phone into Leah Donovan's backpack. This was a premeditated act of fraud and child endangerment, and I am prepared to submit the evidence to federal authorities immediately." Gasps rippled through the rows like aftershocks. Arthur Lynn, who had parroted Cassandra's accusations, sank lower in his seat, his hand trembling slightly as he pulled it away from his tie. Selena Ward lowered her phone, her recording abruptly ending as she tried to shrink into anonymity. Cassandra, however, crumbled in real time, her veneer of composure peeling away with every word. "That's not, I didn't, this is all a mistake." She sputtered, her voice rising into a pitch that betrayed her panic. Donovan finally addressed her, his voice calm, almost quiet, but laced with a fury that was far more dangerous than shouting. "You framed my daughter. You incited a mob. You humiliated an innocent child to satisfy your prejudice and desperation, and you did it while drawing a paycheck from my company." He paused, letting the weight of each word settle like stones. "You're finished, Ms. Bellamy. Professionally, legally, and morally. Effective immediately, you are terminated with cause. There will be no severance, no references, and no protection from the legal action that is already in motion." The cabin was utterly still. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Donovan glanced briefly at Rivera and Torres, his expression unreadable but sharp enough to cut. "Take her," he said simply. As Cassandra was led down the aisle, her protests reduced to incoherent fragments. The passengers avoided her eyes, the weight of their own complicity heavy in the silence. Leah, now free, clung to her father, her face still streaked with tears, but her breath evening out with each passing moment. Donovan leaned down, whispering something only she could hear. And for the first time since the nightmare began, Leah's shoulders eased. The cabin lights seemed brighter now, the tension slowly uncoiling, but no one forgot what had just unfolded. They had seen the cost of silence, the power of truth, and the reckoning that comes when those with real influence decide enough is enough. And yet, this wasn't the end. This was only the clearing of the stage. What Donovan was about to build next, from the ashes of humiliation and fear, would shake the corporate and social foundations far beyond this single flight. Morning broke over Boston, with a sky painted in soft gold, a calm that felt almost surreal after the chaos and heartbreak that had unfolded just hours before. Leah Donovan stood at the tall windows of her hotel suite, the faint hum of the city below, blending with the distant call of seagulls from the harbor. Her hands rested on the cool glass, her reflection staring back at her, still the same 8-year-old girl, but somehow different. The wide-eyed innocence had not vanished, but it had been reshaped into something stronger, something that carried both the quiet ache of betrayal and the early glimmer of resilience. Downstairs, the ballroom of the Beacon Grand buzzed with anticipation. The Mathematics Hall of Fame induction ceremony was set to begin, and despite, or perhaps because of the maelstrom Leah had endured, the event had drawn unprecedented attention. Professors, researchers, and scholars from across the globe were in attendance, but so were cameras from major networks eager to capture the image of a child who had survived what should have broken her spirit. Leah walked into the room hand in hand with her father, Donovan. Donovan, his usual steel composure softened by the protective grip he held on her small hand. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic prelude, just the sound of hundreds rising to their feet in a standing ovation that began as a ripple and swelled into a wave. It wasn't for him. It wasn't for the Donovan name. It was for her, the girl who, despite cruelty and fear, still stood tall. Her chin lifted, her eyes bright, even as they shimmered with emotion. When she stepped up to the podium, the room quieted. Leah took a deep breath, glancing at her father, then at the rows of expectant faces. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but carried with startling clarity. "Some people judged me before they knew my heart," she said. "Some believed the worst without asking what was true. But math doesn't lie, and neither should people. I forgive those who hurt me, not because what they did was small, but because I want to be better than the pain they caused." The room seemed to hold its breath. The words weren't scripted, weren't rehearsed. They were the pure distillation of an 8-year-old's truth, the kind that leaves even seasoned adults blinking back tears. Donovan watched her, his chest tightening, not with anger at what had happened, but with awe at the courage it took for his daughter to speak those words after everything she had endured. But the moment wasn't just about personal resilience. It marked the start of something larger. As the applause swelled again, Donovan stepped forward, not to overshadow her, but to use the weight of his voice to ensure that what Leah had lived through would not be in vain. He announced a sweeping initiative, a $100 million endowment, to establish the Horizon Scholars Program, designed to identify, mentor, and protect gifted children from marginalized backgrounds who might face the kind of prejudice Leah had encountered. Beyond scholarships, it would provide legal advocacy counseling and pathways into elite academic and professional spaces, ensuring no child with brilliance would ever be left unprotected simply because of who they were. The ripple was immediate. News outlets began broadcasting live not about the scandal anymore, but about the shift, a promise to transform outrage into action. Other corporations, shaken by the viral storm that had exposed not just one act of cruelty, but a culture of silent complicity, reached out within days to join the funding effort. Airlines announced reforms in how they trained staff and handled passenger accusations. Advocacy groups began to coordinate with the Horizon Scholars Program, vowing to push for legislation, protecting young travelers, and combating systemic bias. For Leah, the meaning of it all was quieter, more personal. That evening, long after the cameras and the speeches, she sat by the window, again her math tablet balanced on her knees. The numbers, steady and absolute, felt like old friends, reminders that logic and truth still existed even when people failed. She knew the world would remember her name not as a victim, but as the spark for change. She didn't ask for it, didn't want to be a symbol, but as she worked through another calculus problem, she whispered to herself, if it helps other kids, maybe it was worth it. Outside, Boston's skyline glowed beneath the twilight. In the distance, Donovan stood by the balcony phone in hand-fielding calls from other CEOs and lawmakers already pledging support. For once, his empire wasn't just about profits or innovation. It was about people, starting with the girl who had reminded him, in her quiet, unshakable way, what real power looked like. And as the city lights reflected in the hotel glass, father and daughter each found a measure of peace, not because the turbulence had been forgotten, but because they had turned it into a horizon neither of them could have imagined when the nightmare began. What began as a simple flight from Los Angeles to Boston became a story the world will never forget, a story that peeled back the layers of prejudice, fear, and silent complicity only to reveal strength, courage, and transformation at its core. Leah Donovan, just 8 years old, walked onto Flight 447 with nothing but her math tablet, a first class ticket, and the quiet confidence of a child destined for greatness. She was the youngest inductee ever to the Mathematics Hall of Fame, a prodigy whose mind could solve equations that baffled scholars decades older than her. Yet none of that mattered in the eyes of one person, a woman consumed by prejudice and desperation, who decided that Leah didn't belong. Belle Stratton's actions weren't just cruel, they were calculated. She didn't just humiliate a child in front of strangers, she planted false evidence, incited a mob, and reduced a genius to tears simply because of the color of her skin. An airplane cabin became a courtroom, without a judge, jury, or facts. Leah was handcuffed, ridiculed, and treated as if her very existence in first class was a crime. And yet, in the darkest moment, when even adults who should have known better stood silent, justice arrived in the form of a father who would stop at nothing for his child. Donovan didn't storm that plane as just a CEO or billionaire. He arrived as a father radiating a fury born not of wealth or power, but of love. Alongside a federal air marshal, undeniable video evidence, and an unwavering determination, he dismantled every lie, exposed Bell's scheme, and turned the tide of public shame back where it belonged. In a single unforgettable moment, Leah went from victim to victor, not because she sought revenge, but because truth had louder allies than hate. But the story didn't end there. Leah's resilience and grace in the aftermath became the heart of something greater. Standing on stage in Boston, honored for her extraordinary achievements, she spoke with a simplicity and wisdom that adults twice her age often lack. Some people judged me before they knew my heart. Some believed the worst without asking what was true. But math doesn't lie, and neither should people. I forgive those who hurt me because I want to be better than the pain they caused. Her words, gentle yet powerful, didn't just inspire a room, they sparked a movement. From that moment forward, Donovan pledged to ensure no other child like Leah would face such cruelty unprotected. The Horizon Scholars Program was born, a $100 million initiative to mentor, protect, and champion gifted children from marginalized backgrounds. Airlines, corporations, and advocacy groups followed, enacting policies and partnerships designed to confront bias head on. What began as an injustice became a turning point, a storm that cleared the skies for a better horizon. And here lies the lesson for all of us. Prejudice thrives in silence, but so does courage. Leah's story is a reminder that standing by and doing nothing can be as harmful as the act itself. But standing up, even in small ways, can change everything. We may not all have Donovan's power or resources, but each of us has a voice, a choice, and the ability to see people for who they truly are, not what we assume about them. So, as we close this chapter, ask yourself, if you were on that plane, would you have stayed silent or would you have stood up? Let this story challenge you, not just to feel, but to act, to see beyond prejudice, to protect the innocent, and to ensure the world we leave for our children is more just than the one we inherited. If Leah's journey moved you, if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel, share this story, and join us as we uncover more real, raw, and powerful narratives that remind us why truth and justice still matter. Every story we share begins with your support, so stay with us because the next one might just change the way you see the world.